So today we're talking about what is a CMS in the era of agents. And CMSs are something that we've worked on at Rangle for quite a long time. We're originally a front end company. We spent a lot of time with Angular 2 when that first release. We were some of the earliest adopters and actually helped Google define the documentation site around Angular 2. We built tooling for that. And as a byproduct, we were there really early on web apps. And so over the years, I've been here since 2017, left for a little while to do some AI stuff. And now I'm back bringing AI back in. And in that time, we've spent a lot of time working with our clients on CMSs, worked with a number of different CMS providers. And now with agents, I think we're doing some of the coolest work I think we've ever done on CMSs. And so I'm excited to kind of share a bit about our journey, a bit about what you can think about in terms of agents and CMSs kind of working together, and how you might redefine CMS in your own organization. So one thing that the era of agents has changed quite a bit on is search. How customers arrive on your site, how customers see your information that's on your site. Now, the retail experience, the search experience is all very different. We've got AEO or AI SEO, and the way that you've configured the content on your site now somewhat dictates how much traffic you get. The easier it is for bots and agents to understand what your site contains, the easier it will be for them to kind of surface that information. And in June, we actually got our first inbound lead that straight up called out that Claude recommended Rangle to them, which was really cool. Before that, we've definitely seen our search traffic transition really dramatically from we have a pretty good SEO presence to now transitioning a bit more toward ChatGPT, refer links, and that kind of thing. And in this process, one thing that we had to own up to is the fact that we've got 13 years of old strategic positioning baked into all of our pages. We had a lot of things that said that we were an Angular shop. We had a lot of things that said strong positions that we had 10 years ago. And now when we've got these agents and AIs crawling our web pages, they're trying to understand us through that content. And so we really realized that as this transition happens, we needed to take a very kind of deep look at how our website communicates who we are. And so we developed a entire kind of coding structure, positioning, and faceting on our website that helps reinforce that structure in a way that now we can change it over time. It's a little bit less fixed. We can clearly see which parts of the site are a bit old, and we can target content more strategically in terms of communicating who we are, where we've been, and say other things like there are a ton of pages on our website that said we were 5 years old, even though now we're 13 years old. So now we can reframe some of those positions because AI agents will read that and they'll read it as inaccuracies or lies on your site if there's differing views. And so they may mark you down a bit for that kind of thing as well. As we realize that we have this huge content debt that we have to solve, we realized that our CMS had quietly become the bottleneck. Our team is really fast to adopt new technology. We're always trying to ensure that we've got a kind of good handle on what's next while being fairly pragmatic about what we adopt. But all of our team has really leaned in on agentic development and building with agents. And so when we looked at the team that we had, the tools that they used, they actually really wanted to use things like Claude Code or Claude Desktop over using a tool and a UI interface. And so we realized, okay, that kind of interface has become a bit more of a bottleneck for us in terms of the work that we're doing, where people want to work. And so something needs to adapt here. And so when we think about what a CMS was built for us and for others, large part of it is letting non-engineers edit changes, make changes to the website, especially complex changes to schemas. It also helped create a publishing workflow, approval chains, content gating, and it also helped control drift to make sure that we have a consistent schema, a consistent structure to the web page that stays in place so that pages don't break, links don't fail, that kind of thing. And so it was a good adaptation to the real constraint of humans not being able to really fit all this in their heads, us needing some sort of interface that could match the work that we were doing. And CMS had done a lot of work to adapt to that by making schemas more programmatic, by trying to change the hard structure that pages maybe had in older systems to now be a bit more schema driven, which has helped. But it still comes with some costs. And some of those costs are, once you've locked into a SaaS provider for your CMS, now your content lives in somebody else's schema. You've got to talk to them through an API to get access to any of your content. Per seat costs kind of grown. Your team grows. Suddenly your costs for all of these things grow, even though you're maybe not even getting that much more traffic or using it that much more. And over time, you have this kind of training debt, and this small changes to your site as your site gets bigger now require more training, more overhead, more approval chains, and sometimes those copy chains can take a really long time. You've also got issues where there's a bunch of different content and a bunch of different systems. You've got a search system, you've got a payment system, you've got a product system, you've got inventory system, you've got your content system. All of these systems have their own silos, and you've got to coordinate changes across them. And then, of course, you've got the kind of mandatory upgrades that you need to have. So if this is familiar, you may enjoy some look at what freedom might look like as we're still figuring it out. But I think we've got a good feel for where things are going. And that's reminding us of this idea of this horseless carriage. Now that editing has gotten a lot faster because we're leveraging AI agents, these abstractions have become a bit outdated, right? These CMSs were built for human editors. And now that we're maybe human editors handing off changes to agents to do work for us, we're starting to realize, oh, maybe that analogy of this being a carriage that now doesn't have a horse and it has a motor, but it can't turn very well, and it's a bit high off the ground, it's easy to tip over. But when it's going fast, it's bumping around too much, right? There starts to be all these other things that start to, maybe the kind of core thing needs to now change. And so one change that we've noticed, because we're leveraging these AI agents, is that we can now build faster, right? Doesn't mean that we can necessarily build better and at high quality, but we can definitely build faster. And so now AI has changed that trade-off, right? The build was slow. It was hard to change content. We built these systems to allow us to change content, but now the build is fast. What does that say about how we change content? What does that say about how we can own that work, right? And because the build is becoming fast, that kind of changes that build versus buy conversation of, what do we think we should do? Should we build this out? Should we buy something that exists? And so that's where we started thinking about our website. We're all somewhat builders now. What should we do here? So we decided to take this on, and over the course of about 5 focused weeks, we transitioned 850 pages of structured content off of our Sanity CMS. We spent about 35 days coding, this one developer, and we were able to get it all across with zero downtime. We only had one kind of batch job that needed to run. It cost about $20, just because we have a ton of blog content, and we've got 13 years of content data. And then we use a flat Claude Code subscription for the max tier on that. And through a structured process of how we defined that schema, how we defined the end state, and how we migrated the things across, we're actually able to migrate our entire site in about 12 times faster than we would have previously. If you think about how it might have taken, I think before it was 3 months, 3 developers to do our last migration. 1 developer, 1 month is a pretty good speed up. And Cursor, Lee Robinson at Cursor, he actually migrated Cursor off as well, their CMS, in about 3 days. He measured his token use, about $260 in tokens using Cursor. And we've got that same argument here of, once we realized what parts of the CMS we really were reliant on, and we started breaking it down and using the strangler pattern think through what pieces we needed, we were able to move off fairly quickly and be a bit more self-sufficient in terms of what we were building and define it in such a way that it works well for agents. I hinted at it before, but yeah, we used the stringlet pattern. We took our house, we took our site, and we went room by room, moving a specific room over one at a time. We proxied that specific set of routes across so that we would essentially build it out, define those routes, and proxy that traffic across the other site, test it, validate that we weren't breaking our site in the process, and basically achieve zero downtime because we were constantly doing small releases, small changes to individual sets of pages within our site. The other thing we realized is that this wasn't 850 pieces of work. It wasn't 850 issues. We had tens of targeted templates that defined sets of pages within our site. And then we had one big template, which was our blog, which has migrated across, I think, 4 different blogging providers over the years. And so there's a bit of debt there and some editorial work to do to correlate and recombine all of that back down. But we realized that this wasn't scaled. The effort here wasn't really linearly scaled to how many pieces or how many pages there were to do. This was actually something that once we had a targeted approach for specific templates, we could bring across groups of pages bit by bit incrementally and be a lot more efficient and a lot faster at moving everything across. And because we had AI agents that could go in and look at our previous site, look at our new site, and run through a bunch of tests, we're actually able to bring across every link we had on the previous site, write redirect rules, move things over that maybe don't make sense, and redirect to new pages. If there's some old stuff that we didn't want to keep, we could do that as well. And so we were able to move everything across very seamlessly. It was a very seamless process for us to do the migration. And so I'll give you a quick demo of what's possible with this now that we've got the whole site set up. So we just went ahead and just added this adopt CMS, agentic CMS solution page here. And from that issue, this page was built out. It looked around our site. It grabbed a image from the webinar actually to just use as a background image here. It tied it to some of the facets. So the webinar is actually just coming through because it has a facet for CMSs that came through. And then it just filled in some content related to the work we've been doing on agentic CMSs. And because we've got a good context lake set of context to pull from, it's able to build out a really great kind of first draft at this that can get us thinking about, oh, what do we actually want on a page like this? Because it also has everything connected, we have all of our blogs locally stored within the repo. We can also understand which blogs might be a good fit and connect the specific links to those blogs and embed them on the page here. Connecting capabilities as well. A lot of this stuff can just be driven by those facets. And then down at the bottom, there's a more procedural dynamic blog section that's just driven more specifically by the facets themselves. Exactly. That's a really good one. If I go into our search and we go into the blog here, then we can also see the use case that got built out here. And we can see all those new pieces of content that have been tagged as well for this. If I go into one of these and we go down to the bottom of the page, we can also see that the adopt agentic CMS was actually also added to the blog here as a link, which is just a tag essentially on that blog post. But now we've got this really great system that's driving a lot of the content and the work that's being put through. We can add a use case to our facets, like register it within our site. Agents can help us author the different pages. We have a content validator that now when the AI is going through and adjusting some of the schemas and some of the different content to validate that it's valid for all the pages that it changes, this will fail if there's an issue with how it structured that. So there's checks as well on the work that we're doing. And because we've built this into some of the existing templates of the pages that we have, even though it's a very dynamic page, like I didn't show the actual content of the page, but if I go and we go look at the new page that was added, you can see that this page has specific components baked into the page. That's a very dynamic page. We can put raw text in, we can put specific React components in. It's very dynamic, but even though it's such a dynamic page, if we go and look at the OG tags for it, I think this is showing up. Yeah. We can see that all that Open Graph content is still showing and being pushed through here correctly because we're still using the template that's under the hood here. So we've got a lot of these supporting systems that exist still similar to what you might see in a regular CMS. We've just been able to establish it for ourselves here. Or if you're using a headless CMS, you had to build it yourself anyway. So we've used that experience as well to just build it out. We've also got our LLMs full text as well. So we've got that prioritized for agents to come in and read through our content. And going through and retagging content is now a conversation. It's not hunting around, looking for boxes, figuring out where that config is hidden. Now we have agentic helps to kind of do that work for us. Let's just check in. Oh yeah, okay, no questions yet. But if anybody has any questions as we're going through, feel free. I'll stop intermittently and just answer stuff if there's anything. When we think about where our CMS went, it didn't disappear, right? We didn't get rid of the CMS. We just decomposed it into smaller pieces that work better for the work that we're doing with agents. We took the content model and we decomposed that into facets. We took that editorial gate and the content checking to validate that we have the right format, and we turned that into a custom validator that runs every time we make a change. And so even though an agent went through and made this pull request of work that was done here, there are several checks that always run every single time in our linter to validate that content actually looks correct and that it's working well, right? So we're checking all those files, all those facets, all the team records, all the blog posts, and validating every single time. And then in terms of auditing version history, we've got Git. It's a Git repo. So we've got all the content there. In terms of our editing interface, now it's moved to the agent. We have an agent that's doing work with us, right? And in terms of having a database, we have, aside from the little database we have for search, which is a mirror of the content data on our site, for the large part, we just use our repository and we use static rendering to build out all of the different pages. We're able to still do a lot of the things that a traditional CMS did, just we've moved where things are. And I think the biggest challenge, the biggest worry that we get when we think about moving to agents, moving to something that is built, not owned, is now having to own that code, right? And so one piece of how we've been working through that is for members of the team or members of our clients that want to be able to do that same kind of work, but don't want to get into the code, don't want to have to set up an ID experience and GitHub and all that stuff. We've actually built a request tool that essentially allows them to submit requests. Our system can turn those requests based on the code into tickets. We have an agent that can pick up that work and turn that into a preview link. And then that same person who requested that work can go through and validate the work that was done. And so our agent essentially becomes the editor, and your content team now becomes the judge of what content got pushed through. And so we're able to iterate through a lot of changes that way now, which is very exciting. And so we're changing how we're working with these agents, right? Tools are starting to become the easy part of what we're building with. We're able to build tools for ourselves. And so as we know what pieces we need, how we can hand those pieces off, we're actually building a lot of a kind of repeatable pattern that we can work through in terms of how we work on a CMS together with agents and members of our teams. And so the biggest thing that changed, and I think this is when we take a step back and we think, okay, we got the site, we've got a CMS, we've got work happening on it, but agents are doing the work. What does that mean? I have this idea of a square and a circle. Square comes from the circle. And essentially, it's a well-defined, structured, well-measured understanding of something, right? I'm going to convert this specific blog from Sanity to MDX, and the front matter has to be set up in just such a way, right? There's a well understood kind of idea of some work to be done. This is a well-bounded, checkable, agentic, capable task to be done, right? We can hand that off more easily to an agent to work through that. And it doesn't necessarily need a person watching over the shoulder, as long as there's good checks in place, good harness work in place. When we think about the work that humans are still doing, we're doing circle work, which circle work is less structured, less bounded, less well understood, and trying to understand, okay, if we want to get off of our CMS without breaking anything, what do we need to do, right? Coming up with strategy, coming up with structure, evaluating and thinking through the kind of situation of the work that needs to happen, right? And so this kind of difference of understanding these two kind of domains helps us understand what work we hand off, what work we keep. And so when we hand off that work, how do we trust it? How do we trust that that work was done, right? We know both pieces of work need to happen, but we need to make sure that both are done in a diligent and strong way. We try and have the work prove itself. We have the agent run its own checks. I had my agent run the actual dev server against a agent browser to validate that that work was done correctly. They actually look at the page and see if the page renders and that kind of thing. They can also run the tests. It can run AI checks essentially on the work that's being done. We can also review the result, not the diff. So because we're actually building these preview links, and we've been building an entire kind of system of infrastructure to be able to more consistently do this in more spaces, we're also able to now review the actual outcome of the work that's being done. When we think about grading it or having the review done agentically, we also hand that off to separate agents. We don't just use the same agent that built something as the agent that reviews it. It's good to have a fresh perspective on the work that's done, just so we catch little problems as they happen. And then we try and check what it was told, right? I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in the work that we're doing is sometimes the agent was given input that wasn't quite what we were actually looking for. If I go look at the page that we built actually for the demo here, this page is heavily baked in on this webinar because that's the content I gave it. I gave it the idea of, I want to build a page around agentic CMS. Here's this content. Can you build me a page for this? It just took that context that it had of this webinar and ran with it and built out this page. But this page is very focused on what I'm talking about today. It's not a general solution. It's not a conversation about the possibilities of agentic CMS. It's a bit of a webinar of what we did here. And there's literally one of the slides lives in here. So when we think about how to trust it with work, we have to make sure that we also give it good inputs in terms of what work there is. One of the best inputs you can give it is actually your content, as long as you've validated and trust that content as well. So it's another reason to bake in your content with the work that's being delivered as well. So it's an added benefit we have. The agent needs to be able to see your content in order for it to be able to use that content to do better work. And then I think keeping it explainable is really important. There's a lot of software factories or this idea of building massive agentic orchestrators to do work. And the bigger and more complex your system is, the harder it is to understand small breaks and small fixes that can lead to a problem here, right? So we need to validate that that work is trustable. The way that we do that is following these practices here. We need to make sure that we've got good checks in place that assist us with those agents helping us with the work. This is the trend. We've moved from generating the work, generating these changes, and honestly, that generation wasn't really a huge bottleneck for us. There was already a lot of automation that could happen with some of this. And there are many mechanical checks that we could already do, but now it's just happening a lot faster and a lot quicker, right? And so that's one piece that's changed. And then, but judgment has become much more important because now that generation happens faster. So now we need to be able to judge it more quickly, right? And so when we think about when we're working with agents, or we're thinking when we're doing this kind of work, it's important that we're handing off the right sized chunk of work to an agent as well. And so if you're just sitting there approving every single thing that it does, you probably could give it a bit more autonomy to just run through the whole set of work. You don't need to be there. That's a waste of your judgment. You only have so much judgment you can spend. You need to be able to go through it and just put your judgment where it matters, right? So you want to make sure you're not paying for that judgment twice. So you build systems that help you establish trust in the work agents do. And then you also, when you need to put judgment in, which you do, to be able to validate that work was done well, you ensure that you're putting the right amount of judgment in the right place. And so when we think about what changed, right? We took our website from a CMS to a bunch of static files and then added a little tiny database on top of it, right? You could dissect it down to that. But what we actually did was we actually built a system, and we understood the system around this, what we built, right? And so we made our site easier to change. We made it more consistent in terms of us being able to deliver higher quality work with less effort. And now we're capable of capturing that learning and replicating that further out into more projects, because now we have a really clear view of this. This has changed how we think about how we go forward with content related site projects as well. And even how we think about now, were we to layer on additional kind of existing CMS features, how would we do it? Because we know the value that this can deliver for us, right? Is this system that we can use, right? This kind of throughput line of this agent doing work for us, and for us to be able to just focus on the planning and the review of that work. So us building this isn't just about the solution that we did, it's actually about the system that we built. So I talked earlier about the several features that were built after the fact. Before the system was built, we actually didn't have a careers page. So we actually have now, our careers page is essentially a Slack bot and a form, essentially, and then some document store. And that works fairly well for our careers at our current size. This webinar, these events are now something that we're driving on. The way that events were stored in the previous system was a bit of an afterthought. So bringing that more to the forefront has really helped us in terms of more deeply layering things into that faceting system that we've built out. We built an entire new content series on top of this. We're blogging a lot more. Britton can definitely attest to the fact that blogs are a lot easier to build out, and promoting webinars like this is also significantly easier. And then, yeah, of course, like even just last week, or maybe the week before, we added semantic search to the website. And so now were you to go to our website and actually search for like agentic CMS, you'll actually come back with some content. There we go. And it covers our blogs or our events or our team, and all the different content that we have on our website. Britton, anything you want to add in terms of blogging and how just making edits has changed as a result of the system?
Yeah, I guess probably the best way to think about this is what we're doing in a lot of ways is teaching the agents what certain patterns look like. So the first time that we wrote a blog post on the new site, the agent spat out a result and it needed work. We needed to move some elements around. The way it was flowing wasn't quite working right. It wasn't looking great on mobile. So there was a bit of a process there in terms of putting that together. But instead of that being the process every time that we make a page, the second time that happens, because we've recorded what worked in the first one, the agent has that to work from. So when I want to put up a new blog post, I can not only just write the copy and give it to an agent, have the agent make a page that's branded and consistent with the Rangle voice that we want to have in our content. Where it gets really powerful is when you can start hooking that same agent into other platforms, usually by MCP, Model Context Protocol, just tools for the agent communicating directly with other systems. And the fact that I can say to the agent, here's my copy, use the connected SEMrush MCP, the one that works for SEO, AEO, and has information on which keywords to perform. It can do a run through the blog post before I post it and give me suggestions on where it thinks that we could change certain wording, certain verbiage to appear better in search. And it makes a significant difference. And we can also we have Post Hub for analytics. We can connect that via MCP to the agent as well. And it can get the analytics from the page and make tweaks or suggestions around here's how the page could be better, here's how it could convert more. I think the real power comes from the fact that all of these different data sources that would have been disparate data sources before that I have to go through and find each piece of information, I can ask just the same agent for, I'm just using Claude Opus, I can just ask for it in plain English. And it can do all of the work that would normally be manually going through analytics and going through SEMrush and figuring out how do we promote this thing and how can we make it more prominent. The agent can deliver that right off the cuff, and being able to do that, I think it's not exactly blog as you asked, Ben, but we're going to be running another webinar after this one. And I'm watching on my other monitor as I have agents working away on variants for the webinar page for the next webinar. I was able to go into Claude, say to the agent, we're going to be running another webinar, use what's in the repo, use SEMrush, use PostHog, help me make a new page for it. It took 6 minutes and we had the page up and running for the new webinar. And I can just hit go live on the site and it would be up and running. That is something that if you told me that was possible a year ago, I wouldn't have believed you. And that's the sort of coalescence, all of the different pieces coming together to the agent and me being able to talk to the agent in plain English, I think overall is the biggest gain. Constantly have the agent considering your data, your information, the existing content on the site. They're great at seeing the big picture in a way that people really can't. And I think that's where I've picked up a lot of benefit from it.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Back to you, Ben.
Thank you. Yeah, great notes. Yeah, it's really changed how much work goes into to doing the work, essentially. And when we now frame this, right? So we have now this capability that feels amazing. It's really empowering our team to be able to do more. We actually think that now that build buy has changed and we can meaningfully help this change, right? When you're looking as an organization to think about building, you could build something in-house and it really needs to be a small team. One of the reasons that this project went so well and so quickly was because the one engineer we had working on it was able to be the full editor of the work and didn't have to go through approvals to change things that stuck in the way of that migration happening, right? So one major piece is as you're going through and you're going through all these old pages and you're going through a lot of old systems and you're going through partial migrations that happened in the past, you need to create a common standard of the work that's being done. You need to adjust things. And even as you notice there's old, outdated content, you need to be able to make small content changes as you go through too. So you need to be able to have somebody that can understand, that can be relied on to do that, and can be given the autonomy to go through and essentially do that work, right? As well as a clear understanding of the system that he's building, he or she. And then if you think about this and you want to do a project like this, another option is of course to borrow, right? Use something online, find a partner who understands this problem and work with them. And through that, you can use that kind of learning that they've already been through to build it out faster, to have something to build off of. And especially now with agents, just having a really good context on the way in gets you so much farther. We're seeing this, it's like a compounding benefit. The better you can set things up at the beginning, the more compounding there is in the work that you have as a result. And so as we've invested in this and as we've worked this problem through across a couple of clients now, we're essentially building out this kind of agentic platform studio model that we've been establishing, because it's just the thing that we need to build to help our clients, but we also want to be partnering with clients to help them build it as well. And so when we think about what borrowing looks like, we can take this validators, this work that we have, and turn that into architecture review gates. We've built out we've been building out a architecture review process that agents can go through to validate that architecture aligns well, that common missteps aren't made in the work that we're doing. We can also look at the way that we've faceted, the way that we've structured the content and informed that content. And I talked earlier about this idea of a context lake. We're establishing this way of capturing context in such a way that it's validated, clearly understood, and can be relied on by these agents to be leveraged. Another huge benefit, and this is like a fun aside benefit, is because we spent so long actually rebuilding our website and redefining it in a common standard, we're actually able to have Claude Design extract all of the components and the design system of the work that we did. And the design system was done a couple of years ago. We've built a ton of design systems, so we took a lot of those learnings into our previous site. And we've now standardized that more consistently across the board. And all of that design system work has now come into Claude Design as a design system there, which actually was used to build this presentation. And so you may see similarities in terms of the font, in terms of the colors, in terms of some of the components. These same elements exist on our site. And now we have this, immediately we can build branded content material off of just the work that was done to even just migrate our site, which is amazing. I don't think there's ever been a CMS migration that resulted in other supplementary material as a result. The way that this has is pretty amazing, that now we can do slides, we can do white papers, we can do all sorts of things with just this design system that we've actually been able to extract now that we've got a common base. And then finally, as we're doing this work to pull apart websites, we've realized that we need to be more involved with thinking about infrastructure. And so we've actually built an entire platform layer that can be inside your servers, your VPCs. It doesn't rely on any external vendors. You can own the code and you can build your own kind of platform layer. By establishing your own platform layer, we can actually pull that CMS work that is already done, that existing layer, we can proxy through and hit a internal cluster of servers that we can set up that allow you to now build preview environments, do a strangler pattern, and pull out parts of your existing CMS and do a much faster and more gradual migration that requires zero downtime. And so through all of this, we're establishing this platform because it's not only it's what we need, but it's what we've noticed our clients need as well. And so this establishes a platform that your team can actually own. And when we build all this stuff, it certainly keeps us honest. When we put all this work in, we established the common standards that we were building. And when we built our first kind of agentic review gates, it gave us an S like right away, because we've got a lot of mechanical checks in place that are validating if we have enough test coverage, if we have enough, the right structure for our harnesses, if the harnesses have the right permissioning set up, if we have all of these kind of different things that we've learned over the process of building agentically, we've compiled that down into a harness evaluation. And our gate gave us a failure almost right away, because we realized, oh, those learnings, it's really hard to establish them consistently across all of our projects. And so by establishing this kind of common gate and leveraging that, we're actually improving a lot of our software much more quickly, and rolling out kind of standards across our projects much faster. Going back to the CMS problem and thinking now through what you do to move to a CMS that's a bit more agentic and out of a maybe traditional CMS. When we think about what we've done with our approach, we've got structured content, we've got publishing workflows through Git. We've got that as version history as well. We can control our drift using AI and using content typing and tagging and our faceting system. We've got our agent human editing paths as well, which is actually an improvement, not something you necessarily get out of the box before. And then we've also built this machine readable structure that defines all of this content down to content that these AI SEOs kind of pull through. Where you might still need a traditional CMS is if you have RBAC problems, you have a heavy editorial workflow with multiple stages, you need real-time collaboration within content changes, or you may have additional compliance or audit requirements that keep all of your content in a separate space because potentially it's sensitive data. Those may all keep you in a more traditional CMS space. However, again, because we're starting to lean into looking at platforms and looking into the infrastructure work, we're actually able to start diving into that space a bit more too. We didn't need it for our blog and our website, but we're starting to get into building out some of those systems as well in a bespoke manner that you can own rather than having to rely on a third party. So if you're interested in that, you can also reach out and talk to us about that too. But I think when we're thinking about agentic CMS and just thinking about CMS work, whatever you can do, and even just owning the CMS yourself without any kind of additional platform work, you can own quite a bit of that problem for very low investment, which is really exciting. So if you want to start thinking about this and you start thinking about, I want to run my CMS in an agentic way, there's a couple of checks that we can do. The first one is if we can find some way to edit content on your existing site, is there a way for an agent to help you edit that content? A lot of these provider platforms do now provide a CMS interface. Now, the problem with headless and the problem with a lot of the providers that exist, now we no longer have our content and our website in the same place. So we have this issue now where even though you have an agent that can run against your content, it can't actually run against your site. So more meaningful structural changes to your pages aren't something your agent can actually help you with. But still, even can you actually change content faster and more effectively with an agent than your CMS's UI? And if you can, that kind of tells you something. If we think about fluency, that's also really important. We were able to do this because our team was excited about where the work was being done and how we were doing the work. A lot of our team was excited and interested in the work that can be done agentically. And so that was something that we could leverage in when we think about looking at other teams and how other teams work. That also indicates how much interest and whether or not these tools can be relied on for doing agentic work this way. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the final bit, you need to go through and just kind of think, okay, given our kind of existing editorial workflow, given the existing work that we're doing to manage the CMS content on our site, how much of that is actually required for our site? CMSs give you a lot of different tools, bells and whistles to use, but you may not really be using most of them. And when you start breaking down what features you actually use, you may be overpaying because you're bundled into this large price point for a set of features that is actually pretty minimal. And so with those three, you can start to think about, okay, is it maybe time for us to think about another option? And so the biggest thing that we've found, and the thing that kind of inspires us in the work that we're doing now, is the number of things to migrate doesn't determine how complex the migration is. And that's really cool. That's really, really amazing. It changes how we think about agency work. It changes how we think about consulting work. It changes how ambitious we can be about making these migrations. There's still some factors to think about. We do have to still factor in how much judgment does there need to be in the work that's done. But this is a really cool thing that really enables us to do some cool stuff. So the tasks actually got smaller, but the job got a lot bigger. The work to be done is now not just moving the small thing to a new space. It's actually thinking about how that move happens, what our platform is, how to define that new platform, and how to define how we want to work in it. And so, yeah, that summarizes it.
We've actually already got a question in from Thomas. Thomas is asking, how, where, and will accessibility be implemented in a system like this, where web content accessibility guidelines and or authoring tool accessibility guidelines apply?
Yeah, awesome. That's a really good question. I think there's a bunch of pieces here. One is when I talked earlier about AI agents and agents being able to do some work, if there are automated checks that can be made in the browser. That's a baseline one, right? You can do some work to do your kind of accessibility stuff just to do some basic validations, right? But when we think about defining these sites and when we think about defining these kind of common templates, that decomposition of the UI is a really great opportunity to define a design system. And when we define that design system, that's a really good opportunity for us to think about how those components that we're decomposing are accessible. And because now we're using agents to do a lot of this work, we can now think about nudges in a helpful way, right? So if you go to thinking about Shopify, for example, old Shopify before Liquid, you had these modules that had to exist within the page. And so how much of the work you could control was always very limited to just a specific section of the page, right? You could figure out how you could code each of those different pieces. But if you wanted to make larger, more structured, more consistent changes, you had to go up a layer to a template or a template's template and think about how these things are composed together. And at some point, there would be some limits that you would hit. Because we're doing agentic work and because we own the code, similar to headless, we can actually think now much more about how we structure the page. But that's only one layer. The other thing is agents have the ability to have vision. So when we think about all this old content, all these old images, and potentially imagery that actually has content within it, we can also do a pass, right? The batch pass we did over all the blog pages cost $16. The reason it cost $16 was because it was half price. The reason it was half price was because we did a batch of calls across all those pages, given a very specific outcome we were looking for. If you think about all the content and all the images that exist on your site, and you wanted to do a classification pass over all of those, you could do a batch at half cost with AI to run through all of those and create alt tags or alt text for every single one of those and detect if it needs it. There are some that don't. So there's some really interesting possibilities there, but you only can get that if you can access all those images, right? If you can get to them, right? And if you have more control over your content, if you have more control over your images, then you don't have to incur bandwidth costs, download costs, those sorts of things as well in the work that you're doing. And for a large part, when we're thinking about content, especially web content that's published, we don't need to be worried about giving our content to AI agents because for the large part, AIs that are crawling web pages are already accessing a lot of that content anyway. If you're using a API call and you have your permissioning set up correctly, you're not giving them permission to use the result of that data as well in their training as well. There's some interesting possibilities like that as well. Skills, rules for changing files. You can set up a lot of kind of permissions and boundaries there. We have a number of different rules defined for how we build content to nudge Claude in the right direction at the last possible moment. A lot of that helps us make sure that these changes are done well. So great question, Thomas. There's a lot of different pieces we could go into there, but I hope that kind of covers a bit of it. Yeah. And then in terms of the tests that you guys can run this week, again, I would take a look at what's possible with agents on your current platform. What are the gaps? What are the pieces you're using? If you'd like to have us run through it with you, we'd be happy to talk about it and just go through it. But we'll definitely be dropping this recording and these slides in a white paper for anyone who's interested. But I'm happy to answer any more questions in the last couple minutes here if anybody else has anything that they'd like to ask. I don't think you can unmute, so you have to leave a comment in the chat. I did see we had a bunch of polls. Let's see if I can look through those really quick. So we have a lot of people that aren't using these kind of mainline chat systems. That's interesting. I'm really curious what system you're using if it's not any of these. lots of Contentful, lots of Sanity, some Strappy, some Sitecore, pretty great. And then, yeah, low percentage of the organization or high percentage. We got a really big gap in the middle in terms of what, if people are using or not using AI. That's really interesting. Very cool.
Just something to add here too that I think is quite interesting, speaking from the perspective of most companies don't have even the majority of people working agentically yet. These systems don't require your entire organization to be working agentically. One of the major benefits of this system, the way that we have it set up, is that I think Ben showed them earlier, but those Vercel previews that come up are excellent for sharing something that I'm working on with the team. So just because I'm using Claude to work on this doesn't mean that all of my colleagues need to be using Claude to work on this. I can still send them those preview links and they can just say to me, we want to change XYZ, or let's do a different variant to the page. And all it takes is me just communicating that to my agent. The update is made on the page and those preview links automatically update themselves. So I can just go back to my teammate a few minutes later and say, I've made those changes you wanted. And these are very significant changes a lot of the time. And the agent will have knocked those out in 5 minutes and then passed all of these different validation steps that we have for the content, and the preview will auto-update it. And just removing the friction there when it goes to getting review of stuff, because the human review is still critical as a part of our process. Lower friction there has made an astounding difference to me. I didn't realize how much time I was spending on things that agents could be doing until agents were doing them. And I was going, oh, this doesn't take me half of my day. This is 5 minutes now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I saw a post today that was, your agents should be taking recordings of features, because a lot of times now there can be flickers or small issues with features that you can't see from a screenshot. And so the idea now that we have these preview environments and just having agents even run against those, there's a lot of cool possibilities for what could be done there. But I agree, preview environments are critical for being able to make a really good workflow for working with these tools. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Great. I don't see any more questions, so I guess we'll wrap it up here. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll be forwarding along some materials for you. And yeah, don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out if there's anything you feel like we could help you with related to your CMS work. Thanks so much. Anything else? Words, Britton?
Thanks for coming, everybody. And I hope you can successfully work with agents with your site. It's been a revelation for me. So I'm really hoping more people get access.
Absolutely. Me too. Great. Thanks, everybody.